So I'm delighted to be joined by the panel to discuss this. First up on the panel, we have Marc Fungard, who is the Global Head of Financial Crime at Stripe. Then we have Jess Sommerlad, who's the Head of Public-Private Partnerships at the National Economic Crime Centre at the National Crime Agency. Then we have Eglė Lukošienė, is that good enough? Sorry. Who is the Director of the Centre of Excellence in Anti-Money Laundering in Lithuania. And finally, we have Geoff White, author and investigative journalist, and his latest book, Rinsed, reveals the impact of technology on the world of money laundering. So, starting with you, Marc, maybe you could set the scene for us. A very broad question. How has technology changed the financial crime landscape over the last 10 years?
I think, Kathryn, I'd actually start, I think you just heard quite a lot of that. I'll come back to it in a minute, there'll be others who have sort of more specific kind of insight into typologies. But I think before we talk about how technology's changed the financial crime landscape, we have to talk about how it changed the financial landscape. And I think if you kind of start from, look, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the way you onboarded was different. The way we managed technology was different. The way you would expect a payment to flow would be different. And Stripe's very fond of talking about how it abstracts away complexity. What that really means in technical terms is it just makes everything flow faster and smoother. What that allows is businesses to get started and to operate much more quickly and at a much more global scale than would have been possible previously, just because of the friction created by kind of previous systems. So before we kind of come to, boy, that does make financial crime a lot easier in some ways, it also makes financial activity, growth, human progress a lot better and a lot quicker. And so, just to give you an example, I'm a fan of board games. I've been asked to a financial crime conference. I'm going to talk about board games. There's a whole industry, in fact, of very small indie publishers, companies of 3 and 4 people who design a board game, fund it via crowdfunding, connect to production places all over the world, and then ship it globally to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people who then enjoy the games. In a world that feels really fragmented, allowing people to have games that they play together feels really important. So I do think in terms of how you improve the financial landscape, there's a lot of benefit here. Now, of course, as we improve our ability to do that, technology solves a lot of other problems. We can talk about how, I think it was really fascinating to hear that deepfakes are actually technically really hard. I think, I'm tempted to make a joke there about how the criminals just forgot about technology, but of course that's not true. I think, so what you then see is the speed and rapidity of the global market in data, the global market in finance, is also then used by kind of nefarious actors, criminals, state actors. I think, though, and I think it's important in a room like this where we all, I think, can fall into Oliver's kind of existential dread, that we kind of remember that the technology is not the cause of that. It's an enabler for both good and evil. And that it demands of us is that we then be really curious about how that technology works, about how criminals use it, how they use it, and I think the point that was just made about how they use it specifically and what that means for us is incredibly important. And to also then think about how we use it proactively to defend, and I guess we'll talk more about that, but maybe I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Marc. I think that set the scene very well. And maybe if we focus first on the threat actors and their use of technology. Geoff, maybe if I come to you, as I said, your last book looked at how technology has changed the way in which criminals launder money. How has it changed the way in which criminals launder money?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's worth looking at 2 sides of this. You can look at the kind of traditional finance side, or TradFi, as some in the crypto community sort of sneeringly refer to it as. The technological revolution that's overwhelmed, run over society has run over traditional finance as well, and that's been driven a lot by consumer demand. As consumers, we don't want to wait 3 days for our checks to clear anymore and payments to clear anymore. It's crazy. I want to be able to set up my account really quickly online using my mobile phone. I want my payments to clear really quickly internationally. And if I want to leave the bank and go to another one, I want that to be seamless as well. And the regulators and legislation's got behind this. You have things like Open banking, PSD, faster payments, it's all getting things to move faster and smoother, the stuff that Stripe does a lot of. Now, obviously, for criminals, they're looking at that thinking, well, this is great. If you think about what Tony was up to, Tony does not want the money to sit in his drop account that he's using to launder it a second longer than he has to. He wants to bounce it out really quickly. Faster payments, brilliant. He wants to set up his accounts, his mule accounts, really quickly. If he can set them up on his mobile phone in 6 clicks using a phone he just bought at CEX, great. So the technological underpinnings that have underpinned a lot of this traditional finance development are actually of real use to crooks. So that's all in the sort of traditional finance space, probably quite familiar to you folks. You've also got the whole area of what you might call sort of new finance. So obviously cryptocurrency is the sort of go-to thing for that. But I think it goes beyond cryptocurrency. I think you've got to think about sort of stores of value that new technology is creating. So yes, cryptocurrency, which regardless of your view of it, I have read Bitcoin's obituary pretty much every year, and it's still around, and it's still going strong and surging in value. You've also got things like NFTs. You've got video game currencies. You've got OnlyFans accounts, at which point people start to shift slightly in their seats. But these are stores of value, and for criminals, they look at these kind of new areas, these new stores of value, and see a whole new play space. Because these new areas of finance have got really 3 advantages for crooks and money launderers. Firstly, they're pretty much unregulated. I mean, august as the work of the National Crime Agency is that you do. I don't think you have a whole team looking at roadblocks for fraud and crime on video games. At one stage, by the way, there's a game called Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which gamers among you will know. At one point, the entire marketplace around Counter-Strike was all fraud. It was all fraud and money laundering. They closed the marketplace down. Now, you may not care about video games, but those criminals absolutely milked that marketplace. Whole new areas of value being created. So you've got unregulated space in those new finance areas. You've also got international seamless spaces. So again, these companies that get created, that create these new areas of value, they want the currency and they want the value to move internationally seamlessly. NFTs move internationally across borders. There's no sort of clearance system for them. And thirdly, the valuations in these kind of areas of new finance are hugely febrile and fluctuating. How much is an NFT worth? You may think it's nuts that somebody paid $1 million for something that looks like a bad cartoon of an ape, but that's how much it's worth. So again, for money launderers and fraudsters, you can put money into these new stores of value, big amounts of money, and it won't ring alarm bells because apparently an NFT of an ape is worth $1 million. So there's a whole kind of play space. And you might be thinking, well, these new areas of finance, I work in a bank, a traditional bank. We don't do cryptocurrency, we don't touch NFTs, video gaming isn't part of what we do. But that's where it gets interesting. Between the sort of traditional finance area and these new finance stores of value, there are sort of crossover points. For example, increasingly people in the UK will own a crypto asset. I think 12% was the last figure I heard for how many UK adults own a crypto asset. Well, they may not, they will increasingly want to put their crypto asset with you and have you custody it. And even if not that, when they sell that crypto asset, the money they make, they want to put in their bank account. Well, that's you. So your exposure to these new areas of finance, these new realms of finance, is going to get greater. Also things like Tether. Tether's a fascinating example, because it's, again, one of these crossover points between TradFi and new finance. Tether, as many of you will know, it's a stable coin, it's a cryptocurrency, it's linked to the value of the dollar. There's all sorts of issues around Tether, which we can go into. But again, it's one of those crossover points between traditional finance and sort of new finance. So I think as finance folks, you have to kind of think about, even if you're working in that traditional finance space, you've got to think about these new stores of value and how they're going to impact on you. Because the crooks absolutely are. Time and time again, crooks go to those new stores of value for all the reasons I've explained. Febrile marketplace, lack of regulation, international market. For a money launderer, for a fraudster, bang, that's where I'm going to go. And people like Tony are increasingly going to go.
Thank you. So, Jess, we've heard some comments from Geoff about whether the NCA has everything that it needs. But from a law enforcement perspective, how are you seeing kind of the main threats from technology?
I think it's super interesting. We don't have a team of people working on Counter-Strike Marketplace, unfortunately, but perhaps that's a good thing. I think there's 2 sides to this. Obviously, you've heard from Will this morning, I think, about destabilize. I think just reflecting on that last panel from Tony as well, what fascinates me is that commingling of the traditional methods and typologies of money laundering and the technological advancement. I think that has 2 sort of distinct corollaries for our response. The first is making sure that we kind of obviously understand and engage with the threats as they're presented. I think destabilize is a good example of that. I think secondly, it's about engaging with the right partners, so people like Stripe. We've got a public-private crypto forum now in the National Economic Crime Centre where we've brought together exchanges and blockchain analytics to try and have a more effective track and trace approach to seizing, identifying and seizing crypto assets. But secondly, I think that point about the nexus between traditional finance and where there might be these emerging risks from decentralized finance or other forms of tech. Actually, there's a more basic question, which is just exploiting the data that we've already got more effectively and understanding how transactions between different institutions work. So over the past couple of years in the NCA, we've been leading a project with a number of UK banks where we have looked at effectively pooling account information and transaction information, looking at the transactions across those institutions, but then also looking at how they overlap with our own data. And I think that shows a number of interesting things. I could speak about it for hours, but we've had great operational successes because of the overlap with ongoing investigations. We've identified new organized criminal groups, but most interestingly, the kind of problem statement questions that we use to interrogate and sort of form that data set at the beginning, we've proven some of them, and we've challenged some of the others. So for example, we looked at, what do we understand about organized immigration crime and how money in relation to organized immigration crime moves. And the preconceptions were proven partially correct, but also really effective identifying cash-based money laundering. So I think that's a sort of garbled response, but I think there's so much there, and I would say, we can sometimes be culpable of a bit of initiativeitis. Like a magpie, you see the new thing, you see, a Bored Ape yacht club, and you think, right, well, they must all be laundering their money through there, but actually it's a complex ecosystem.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Marc.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it speaks to something that was kind of under Geoff's point of going back to the first principles of what is it that a criminal is trying to do, how would we go about finding that? I think it was really interesting in the panel earlier this morning for us to talk about, look, if we all agree the system isn't kind of working now, then why do we think the answer is more of the system that isn't working now? And I think if you start from sort of there and you kind of say, look, there is real value in understanding various data holdings, being able to bring them together, being able to do that in a way that protects privacy, being able to do that in a way that protects civil liberties, feels like it starts to get to a better kind of way of doing it. And I think you're exactly, that's been my experience too, is it's very often not about some data set we don't have, it's more about combining things we do have.
And okay, turning to you. So we've heard a bit about the threat actors, we've heard about the importance of data. Sitting in your position in the centre, for instance, AML, how do you see that we get ahead of the threat of technology?
It's a very difficult question, I should say. If I could give it a recipe, I'm sure I would get every possible award in the financial crime prevention field. So, but from our perspective, from PPP, what I see, we have right now very good background, meaning that we understand the industry, the regulators, and the law enforcement and FIUs, that we have to collaborate. And this is a background for every next step, including technology. And when I say collaboration, I mean that every type, private to private, public to private, private to public, every possible combination. Because when we are united and when we collaborate, this is the first step to be ahead, if it's possible. So, having in mind that we know this main idea how we could improve our effectiveness in the fight against financial crime, then we are moving to next steps. From our perspective, and speaking about technology, I think very important topic and issue and space for new technologies is the private-to-private information sharing. And it's a practical example. This is what we are going through right now in Lithuania and Baltic states and in Europe as well. It took a lot of time, from my perspective, a couple of years to have a national legal framework to do it in practice. Now we are going through the process to get it operational. How many years? I don't know. We expect 2 or 3, but again, 3 years for legislation, then 2 or 3 years for implementation, and this is only the national level. This, in the global world, what we need is the cross-border information sharing. Thankfully, we have an AML directive present, but it will be needed to implement it and the different jurisdictions with the different legal requirements. And this is, from my perspective, our main limitation as a community, that we are regulated. We have to combine different legal aspects, not forgetting data protection rules. And we are slow. We are slow. And this is the kind of illustration of this very well-known saying that the criminals are flying by plane and we are riding a bike. So, on the other hand, we are moving forward. And I'd like to stay positive because I think we could improve and be faster. What we need is to set a clear priority that the fight against financial crime is a priority for government, for industry, for law enforcement, for regulators, for everyone within our community. And this is the key element from my perspective. When the priority is set, the difficult core IT systems become more flexible. Legal questions are moving forward faster. Suddenly we have a funding for different type of projects and different IT solutions and so on and so forth. So I'm positive, and I'm actually hope that there will be a clear prioritization for information sharing and all related tools for effective fight against the financial crime.
Thank you. I think that point about kind of political will is so important. Geoff, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I find that private-to-private exchange really interesting, and I think one of the things that's a benefit to that, if financial institutions can do it, is comparing each other's patterns. I mean, Tony talked about patterns and how as a criminal you're trying to spot the pattern and get around it. I sometimes think of the way criminals behave as being like a Swiss cheese. You know, if I can get my way through all the holes in a Swiss cheese and out the other side, and you can play off financial institutions one against each other once you understand their pattern. This bank checks postcodes, that bank doesn't. Okay, I'll go to that bank, they won't check the postcode. This bank flags transactions above 25 grand and gives them extra scrutiny, but that bank doesn't. Right, so I'll put if you can work out the patterns, you can play off the organizations against each other. What Tony was doing that manually. What we're going to see as technology develops is automation. I can put through 1,000 transactions on 1,000 different accounts I've set up and just see which ones work and which ones don't. Then I've got the pattern. So that pattern spotting and pattern thwarting, I think, is going to become increasingly automated. I think the defense for that is institutions to come together and work out, wait, you do this way, we do that way. There's a hole there that you can get through. The more the institutions can kind of get together and compare. But in the real world, I don't know how that works in terms of commercial sensitivities, how much do you want to share about your processes. So it's all very well for me as a journalist to say that, but I don't know how in practice it works.
I feel like maybe this is a question that Jess can answer as head of public-private partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, that's exactly what we've been trying to do with the project I mentioned, where you know, we're getting the data from these banks, but we're also sharing it back. So we're not just sitting on it at the end. So effectively, you can say, you know, go away and look at what your individual exposure to this potential organised crime group was in your institution, and that might represent or manifest itself differently. I think on your point though about, could you, for example, looking across that data, create a kind of robotic money launderer that you just let loose to see, right, how could you optimize all of the potential gaps and exploit this to kind of optimize the laundering of criminal proceeds? That'd be a really interesting thing to explore. If I could also just briefly, Kathryn, pick up on Egle's point, which I think there's two things there. First, I think cross-border, absolutely agree, and I think the use of privacy-enhancing technologies, for example, might help us break down some of the challenges that there have been historically with, I can see some shaking heads, but perhaps break down some of the barriers cross-border. But secondly, the other point I'd make would be, I think sometimes people think that the answer is just an ever-increasing band of people that you involve in a coalition to respond to financial crime, ever more sectors, ever more stakeholders, and you end up with sort of 20,000 people, and it's like turning an oil tanker. There's still power in kind of more limited collaboration to solve specific problems in addition to pulling on those other levers where you need to.
Marc, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of connect your point, Jess, and Geoff's, it strikes me that there's in that one of the most fundamental disconnects in how we try to solve this problem, which is everything Jess said is entirely right and works, which is law enforcement comes out and says, hey, here's bad things we've seen. Can you go find them? And we all go and we find them, and we have real big, very serious case level impacts. But what Geoff's talking about is an automated kind of way that I am, as the fraudster or the criminal, optimizing every minute of every day. Everything Jess described is reactive. Everything Geoff described is proactive. It seems to me the only way we can really start to get ahead of that is if we start thinking at a systemic level and start thinking about, right, how would we see these kinds of activities move across the network, for lack of a better term. And I think in there, I mean, that is where I think you start to get to an interesting discussion of the emerging technologies as a force for that kind of visibility, and privacy enhancing is certainly a part of that. I think, but fundamentally, if we don't kind of solve for that disconnect, you're just forever on a bicycle, on a biplane kind of problem.
And actually, it leads me nicely into some of the questions from the audience that I'm going to put in now. And do, as you said, scan the QR code and do drop your questions into the Slido. But there were two questions which I think are linked. The first was, what do the panelists feel the future state and challenges are for better exploiting the data we already have, either in policy or detection? And I think a linked question, governments, FIUs, law enforcement regulators already have access to a lot of data. Shouldn't we just add more resources instead of sharing more data? So maybe, Eglė, if I could turn to you first on those two questions.
Yeah, we have a lot of data, FIUs and private sector, and there is a technological question as well, how we can make this data effective. And it's, once again, question of priority, money, and so on and so forth, because technology is expensive, to be honest. And as I mentioned before, if we prioritize, we can make it effective. We provide thousands and thousands of STRs, SARs, and all kind of information to different type of authorities. Yes, it's true. On the other hand, there is data in the private sector as well, in the industry. So in our head, we have to admit that we have to pay a lot of attention and stay open to different types of collaborations and talks to be proactive, as Marc said. So yeah, we have a lot of space for improvement, I should say, and I'm happy that we are discussing on this topic today, and maybe tomorrow we will make new steps in this field.
I think, I mean, Jess, would you just like a load more resources and make with that?
Yeah, in part, I think, obviously. But I think you also have to, just more resources isn't necessarily the answer. So I think there is absolutely something about technology and optimizing that. in public-private partnerships as well, you can use other people's resources to meet a common goal. So in the project I mentioned, we had 10 staff from the banks working as NCA officers, seconded as NCA officers, vetted to the same standards, sat alongside our officers, doing the work, data scientists, intelligence officers, etc. That's really powerful, and that has a kind of symbiotic benefit to both sides, I think, to an extent. I think there is probably, it's a question for a sort of data specialist, but I think in terms of how, there are so many ways in which we could exploit the data that we've already got, and I think partly that is often about bringing more of it together within a joint environment rather than keeping it as a silo, would be my sort of final point on that question.
And Geoff, you've seen how criminals behave. What do you think law enforcement need? Is it just throwing more resources at them, or better targeted resources?
It's an interesting question, and again, as a journalist, I'm blissfully away from that kind of task. But it does strike me that, the best way to do this would be to look at where the threat actors are moving. What are they doing, and respond to that? Because you can amass all of this data, but fundamentally, unless it's stopping bad behaviour, that's not doing the job, is it? The danger with that is you look at the threat today and you don't look at the threat tomorrow. So I think what you need is the bulk of your team going, okay, what are crooks doing right now? What are the modern versions of Tony Sales doing right now? You also need a smaller team looking ahead at future threats and thinking, what are they on the fringes of doing? What are they experimenting with? How serious is that? And that's going to be a more sort of future-gazing team. But then you're sort of led by the behaviour of the bad guys. I think the worry is if you work in financial institutions, you have access to the data, you're sort of led by that as opposed to going back to what the threat you're actually dealing with is, which is fundamentally bad guys.
Yeah. So there's a question here that I was going to ask on central bank digital currencies, which we have not touched on yet. So how could central bank digital currencies impact international trade and security? For example, could the Chinese digital currency be a soft power tool? Is it already a soft power tool? Who wants to put their hand up for that first? Sea of blank faces.
I'd like to throw this to the audience. Put your hands up if you know and understand what central bank digital currencies actually are and will be. Yeah, that's about right. I don't know. So for me, in that case, maybe the august people in the audience who understand this can sort this out. There seem to be two kind of models here. One is the model of, well, we already sort of, as governments, handle the money supply, and we'll just do that sort of digitally. That sort of if you like, a wholesale model of the central bank digital currency. And then there's that's really, when it comes down to it, really boring. That's kind of a boring mechanics thing. Then there's the more exciting, thrilling, and also dangerous bit, which is actually the currency itself, the pound, being sort of digitally replaced. I think the Bahamas has done some interesting experiments around this, around the sand dollar, is it called? And that means that the government is actually issuing currency direct to people to some kind of government-approved wallet, and they're spending it from their wallets in retail environments, which, for those of you who work for banks, is a slightly terrifying. So what, the governments are going to issue currency directly to people? So there's loads of issues around central bank digital currencies as to what it is and how it implements before we even get to the point of how it will be sort of used by criminals. Yeah. So it's a slight rant, that, but I did feel free to.
Yeah, but Geoff, I think it's a really good tee up. I think if you sort of take away the label of central bank digital currency and say, okay, right, what is the benefit of a globalized stablecoin kind of model? There's a lot of things to like there. So if you think about it from a systemic point of view, what can be known across a system, across a blockchain, you can see all transactions over all time. That seems like it might be useful for looking for financial criminals. And you can sort of begin to kind of pull out what are the key things we need to do. I mean, if you sort of do from a first principle standpoint, in any financial system, you need to know who you're dealing with, you need to know how they're transacting, you need to do something when you discover things that you didn't like in either bucket 1 or bucket 2. Digital currencies make that potentially a lot easier around protection of wallets, around kind of digital identity sort of thing. You can see a future where you say, look, there is a digital identity which is a lot harder to crack, is protected in some way. What makes the central bank digital currency sort of concerning is you're then giving all of that data and all of that power to a state power. And then you're saying, all of us, harking back to kind of what Oliver was saying in the morning, if we think 2 to 5% of transactions are criminal, there's not a lot of science behind that number, but it's just the one we all quote, then by definition, 95 to 98% aren't. So are we really comfortable giving to the government the data and visibility of the 95 to 98%. That, I think, is the difficulty of the central bank kind of currency. So I think really the value of it is, the question is, how do you unlock the value of that kind of payment system without getting into the potentially darker aspects of, could this be used by any state actor in a way that would be uncomfortable?
A lot to think about. Eglė, did you want to?
Yeah, I think that from consumers' perspective, CBDC is something excited. Our job as industry regulators and law enforcement, we should, and the central bankers, of course, we should predict what kind of side effects it could bring. Because we are now experienced with the instant payments. We have to admit that the fraud is a kind of side effect of instant payments, so roughly speaking. So when we elaborate the idea of CBDC, we have to be very well aware of what it will bring as a side effect. So I think it's the main idea from the financial crime perspective.
Yeah. And I wanted to, I guess, maybe move from CBDCs to just touch on stablecoins, which have been mentioned a couple of times. Maybe, Jess, if I could come to you first. So some of you would have been in the breakfast briefing we had this morning on Operation Destabilize, which was a Russian money laundering network. Part of it was exchanging cash for crypto, and the crypto that they generally used was a stablecoin. And we've seen other reports of stablecoins being used, being attractive to criminals. So is it something, Jess, that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I'd heard Will had teed up some questions for me, so I don't know if this was one. A bit cheeky. I mean, I think, look, across that landscape, there's probably not loads I can go into today, but certainly I think we are acutely aware of the threat from a range of areas. I think, again, I'd go back to the importance of the collaboration with industry, with relevant experts in those fields to try and sort of identify how we can interdict and when. And yeah, perhaps something to pick up on for me in future. When
Very
I can.
diplomatic answer, Jess. Marc, I know Stripe, I think, has recently bought...
Acquired a stablecoin company, yeah.
A stablecoin. So why in the first place? But also, what role do you think that can play?
Yeah, I mean, I think it harkens back to sort of some of the things I was sort of saying earlier. One of the things that when we made the acquisition, Patrick Collison, one of our founders, called them he called them room temperature superconductors, which, if you're an engineering mind like Patrick is a particular way of unlocking a lot of power. Here I reach the limit of my engineering knowledge. But I think the point of it is, it's very clear that if you're interested in faster, cheaper, easier payments locally and globally, stablecoins have a tremendous amount to do with that in a way that fundamentally the current system can. If you think of the current system as an organic growth over centuries to get to the system we now have, stablecoins kind of goes back to first principles and says, right, but in a world where we can program things, what if we just programmed all that? And so from a financial crime, so from a good of commerce standpoint, you get to all sorts of interesting things about programmable identity, verified identities, tokenized kind of holdings. You can imagine a token around a real estate deed. But you also get to, I think, importantly for this group from a financial crime standpoint, a fundamentally different way to think about how you solve the problem. So if you think now of, look, we have this system that is this organic growth, and what we've done over time is layer in control after control after control to say, we're going to have a connection around, we're going to do all these verifications of all these documents to prove you are who you say you are. And then we're going to have all these other systems that sit up on top to then detect on that. And that's all going to draw from data all over the place and aggregate that together. And we'll do that in a public-private way. It all just sounds really complicated because it really is. If you start from stablecoins, you can say, right, but what if we did that at a protocol level per coin? What if the transaction could report itself? as suspicious. You get to a really fundamentally different way of thinking about the problem. And I think that's why, sort of when I was saying earlier, look, I think we need to think about what the first principles we're trying to solve for here. I just think the challenge of where stablecoins and where this technology goes in time is to say, what is the problem we're actually trying to solve? What are, fundamentally, I think what we're trying to say is, we want to make it really hard for the people who followed Tony to do what they're trying to do. And if we start from there and say, look, what does that do in a stablecoin world? I think you get there really interestingly. Now, having said that, last point. I don't want to let go of the point, my friends who make board games, to say, look, stablecoins allow them to operate globally and simply and in a way that is fundamentally innovative, fundamentally adding to growth globally, which it feels like is also something we can't lose in the fight against financial crime.
Sorry, Geoff.
I find it really fascinating. I think it's a great vision you've mapped out there. I can see two forces sort of squeezing that vision from one side. One side is obviously the criminal side. The reason criminals like stablecoins is exactly this. If you're laundering $1 million for a cocaine dealer, do you want to call that cocaine dealer up and say, oh, by the way, that million is only worth 700,000 today? Sols. Guess we should have swapped out at an earlier time. No, you want the money to be the money, particularly in crime where your life, they'll break your legs if you lose the money. That's the thing. So criminals will and that's why Tether has been so important. Getting your crypto into Tether, get it into Tether. That way it's solid and you know what you've got. So that's the sort of force pushing against that. The other force comes from the kind of legitimate crypto tech community. There's this really interesting psychology that's baked into a lot of the people who actually write the code that runs this. That was that cryptocurrency should have been new. It should have been outside traditional structures. It shouldn't be regulated by all you folks. It was going to be something new. And also, there needs to be privacy somewhere in it. So the people who build these cryptocurrency mixers that mix cryptocurrency around, you probably look at that as money laundering. They look at that as privacy. It's essential privacy-preserving tools. So again, when you come in with this, it's a great vision. You say, we can sort this out from ground up with stable coins. We can build the kind of structure that will really tackle financial crime. The people who write some of this code will look at that and go, not on my watch. I want privacy and I'll push back. And I can write a few lines of code and try and circumvent that, which is what happened with Tornado Cash. That was the mixer of choice, the mixer. Yeah.
And I should say before we move on that there is a lot of research obviously available on the CFS website which talks to many of these issues, including central bank digital currencies and our article on central bank digital conspiracies. So do check those out on our website as well. But I wanted to move in the last sort of 15 minutes of the panel to talk about tech for good. We've touched on it a little bit. I always, I guess, start this kind of conversation by thinking back to my days in the private sector and the number of tech-enabled solutions I saw, which were nothing really more than a fancy Excel spreadsheet, sometimes with a nice dashboard on the front. But I'm really interested, maybe Mark, starting with you, where are we actually really seeing technology being used well in prevention and detection, and where is it really having an impact?
Yeah, I think a couple of different places. So places where it is having impact and places where it could. I think the first thing is, and this is something certainly since I've come to Stripe, I've become kind of much more sort of aware of, is how much more technology signal there is than maybe fundamentally a bank or a regulator or a traditional financial institution might think about. So even things, really simple things like a cell phone that's sitting stable in a dock in a cell phone farm being used for fraud will move and shake differently than one that's being held in the hand of an actual human who is poking and tapping and swiping. That creates a certain amount of signal that can be used. A fraudster will tap and swipe differently than someone who's doing it legitimately. Most people, for example, don't cut and paste their own name into a form. They just type it out. So I think there's a whole bunch of places where you can point to technology being used to aid detection with additional signal that is available kind of beyond sort of the have you provided me the 2 forms of identification, and have I verified that this is in fact a legitimate passport? I mean, that stuff is important too, but I actually think you can get to a much more sort of interesting place. Frankly, that's both more effective in terms of detecting the activity you're trying to detect, and frankly, easier for legitimate people to sort of work with. I mean, so I think that's one. I think the other place it could go, and this is, I think, sort of what Jess was sort of alluding to, is if you could envision we've got lots of experience now over the last decade of public-private partnerships and how they can work and what makes them work well. What we've really struggled to do, I think, as a community, is scale that technologically. And one thing that, again, I now think, having been at Stripe for a while, which is that scaling problem is almost always a technology problem. It's not a question of, do we know how to share information? Do we know which information is valuable? Do we know how to make it better? It's fundamentally a how problem. How do I do that in a way that protects privacy and gets me the information I want and lets me move as fast as I can and doesn't make me wait 6 months and make 3 phone calls? I think that to me is the place where we're beginning to sort of step into that, but I think that feels like the real opportunity.
And Jess, maybe,
Sorry.
Go
Yeah,
on.
no, I was just going to, if I could build on that, I think that's absolutely correct. I think I was going to say there's a data privacy problem, but obviously you mentioned pets, and I think there is an opportunity there. I think, again, to sort of speak to our experience here, we've seen incredible value in combining that data, and that's actually sort of leading to sort of better impact for public protection, which is what, in the National Crime Agency we're here to do, is to make an impact on serious and organised crime. And so I could give one example of the project that we did, where we had a customer from one of the participating banks who hit a number of the triggers, effectively risk rules, that we use to populate the data set writ large. When they were ingested into into the NCA, we washed all of this data with NCA intelligence and records. They themselves were not linked to any NCA investigations, but they were transacting with over 100 entities across the data set who had also hit individual triggers, and 30 of those entities were linked to separate NCA investigations. So it tells you 2 potential things. One of them is that this is a successful commerce business, Jeff Bezos maybe, or secondly, perhaps that they're running a professional money laundering network. It's a really simple technique. What you're doing is you're just breaking down information silos and combining them. But that's not something that we would have been able to do were it not for the significant investment that we've made in our data exploitation capability for the skills of those people. And so it's a technologically enabled, pretty simple thing to do. And I think it speaks exactly to that question of scale. I think, however, when we're thinking about that question of scale, we need to recognize that not all things are created equal. And there may be, some sectors or institutions which don't have volume data that they can provide. And so it's trying to work out what the relevant nodes are, I think, that overlap, that allow you to kind of combat specific threats in specific areas and sectors.
And Eglė, I wanted to come to you with another question, but on the same sort of topic from the audience, which is the role of supervisors in enabling technology to be used by the regulated sector, and how important is the role of supervisors, the role of regulators in encouraging the adoption of technology by firms? Eglė or Jess?
If I could just briefly, and then perhaps hand over, because I can see Andrea in the front row, so I'd just say that the FCA were absolutely critical to the success of this project that I've talked about. They were on our board, which oversaw it and supported from the outset. We also engaged with the Information Commissioner in the UK to give us and the participants the comfort that what we were doing was not only legal, but also supported by the relevant regulators. So, yeah, briefly from me.
Got that. And Eglė, your view on the role of supervisors here?
As an ex-regulator, and now I'm the head of public-private partnership, I think that the role of regulator and supervisors is a key element to facilitate the collaboration. And what I feel that if there is a support and clear priority from the supervisors and regulators, it's easier for the whole industry to understand where to focus. And I think it's a key role of regulators to show the importance, and not only to focus on the on-site inspections or off-site inspections, but to stay with the industry along the whole processes in a financial crime prevention procedures. And if I may, to come back to the technological, positive technological examples, I'd like to share a Lithuanian example. We talked that the fraud was greatly provoked by the technological changes. But what we see from the fraud prevention side, that the systems, technologies that are placed within the industry, they are effective. We are gathering statistics in Lithuania, and what we see that last year, 2024, only half of the sums that was tried to defraud was actually sent to fraudsters. Another half was prevented, and I think it was the majority of the success was based on the technology within the industry. So we have positive examples as well. So.
Yeah. And maybe finally, Geoff, before we wrap up, coming to you. I mean, you see how criminals use technology. You see also how law enforcement and industry and others use technology. Where do you think the pendulum sits at the minute? Who's got the advantage? And if it's criminals, how do we swing it back the other way?
It's interesting. I've got a sort of foot in two camps, really. There's the sort of cybercrime side that I cover and the financial crime side that I cover. Why those are two such separate camps, I do not know, and I think we really need to work on that. But what's interesting is in the cybercrime field, I get asked, are hackers using AI? Honestly, not that much. They're using it, but in the same way we are, to kind of make the existing jobs a bit easier, a bit faster. So on the cybercrime side, cybersecurity companies have been using AI, what we used to call machine learning, for years and years and years to deal with it. So that's still going on. So I think the running is actually on the defender's side, on the cybercrime side. On the financial crime side, it's slightly different, because the financial crime side, so much of it's about identity and creating fake identities and so on. And fraud is a crime of deception at the end of the day, and if you can use deceptive identities and deceptive behavior, that's going to help you do fraud. So financial crime is more exposed to it than cybercrime. And I would say, just thinking about AI and how that's going to get used, you're already starting to see fraudsters using AI and deepfake technology en masse. That's already bedding in. We tend to think of deepfake technologies being used by sort of adversaries and threat actors and malicious people. I think you've also got to start thinking about the idea of deepfake technology being used in a friendly fake way. So I suspect in the future we will start to increasingly use bots to do things. I mean, I don't want to solve my mortgage payments and do my online shopping and stuff. If I could get a Geoff bot to go and do that, brilliant. But then have I authorized the Geoff bot? If my Geoff bot starts doing financial transactions and you're on the other side of that, has the Geoff bot been authorized by Geoff, really? So in terms of identity, you're going to start to see this kind of,
exactly the right
they call it agentic AI, they call it, AI agents. So if you're using AI to sort of fight this, you've got to realize that people on the other side, either threat actors or just legitimate individuals, are going to be starting to use their own AI agents, and you've got to kind of work out how that sits.
And good luck. So Geoff, I completely agree with that, and I want to connect it back to the point of supervisors, because as much as every regulated financial institution will want to help law enforcement, they will really listen to supervisors. And I think as we think about that sort of emergence, and you say, well, right, the regulation is written in some way that never ever imagined there might be a Geoff bot or a Marc bot, and how are we going to then, like, what controls could we bring to bear? Because there are absolutely things you can do to make sure that Geoff bot is authorized by Geoff, and that gets into sort of digital identity and wallets and that kind of stuff. But I think the core is the regulation then has to allow for those controls to go in place, and has to then discuss and be clear on the relative effectiveness of that versus the ineffectiveness of other controls, so that financial institutions can make that switch. Or else what you get stuck with is a bunch of control. I mean, this goes right back to what Tony was saying. It's a bunch of controls pointed at the wrong thing.
Well, and on that note, hopefully the next time you come to a conference here, Geoff bot will be moderating the panel. But please join me in a huge round of applause for our fantastic panelists today.